June 6, 1944. 0630 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy. A German machine gunner pressed his eye to the sight of his MG-42, watching the carnage unfold below. Bodies twisted in the surf. Landing craft burned. Americans pinned against a seawall, drowning in their own blood and seawater. He turned to his loader and laughed, shouting over the roar of sustained fire. They said the Americans would liberate France. Look at them now, fish food and cowards. Along the bluffs, his comrades shared the same dark confidence. The Atlantic Wall had held. The great invasion was dying before it could crawl 50 meters inland. Every Wehrmacht officer watching the slaughter believed the same thing. Omaha Beach would be the graveyard of American ambition, and by sunset, the bodies would be stacked so high the tide would have to climb over them. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. Every week, we uncover the stories the world forgot. What that gunner didn't know, what none of them knew, was that one man, standing in waist-deep water, with a cigar clenched between his teeth and death screaming past his ears, was about to rewrite the rules of warfare on that beach. What he didn't know was that the American machine wasn't designed to retreat. It was designed to adapt, to endure, and to obliterate. And in the next 4 hours, that single general would turn a massacre into a breakthrough, and a breakthrough into the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. His name was Norman Cota, Brigadier General, 51 years old, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division. And while younger officers froze or bled out in the sand, Cota walked the beach like it was a Sunday stroll through hell. The planning for D-Day had been meticulous, obsessive, a symphony of logistics and intelligence that took 2 years to orchestrate. 39 Allied divisions, 7,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, designed to crack open Hitler's fortress Europe and drive a dagger straight into the heart of Nazi Germany. But planning, no matter how precise, dies the moment it meets reality. And reality on Omaha Beach was simple. The pre-invasion bombardment had failed. The naval guns, firing for miles offshore through morning fog, had overshot their targets. The B-24 Liberators, flying high to avoid flak, had dropped their payloads inland, missing the German bunkers entirely. When the first wave of American infantry hit the beach at 0630, they expected to find shattered defenses. Instead, they found an intact fortress, fortified positions dug into limestone cliffs, interlocking fields of fire, and German gunners who had been waiting for this moment for 4 years. The first 30 minutes were a slaughter. Landing craft grounded on sandbars 100 yards from shore, forcing men to wade through neck-deep water under merciless fire. The MG-42, the German general-purpose machine gun, was the devil's own instrument. Belt-fed, firing 1,200 rounds per minute, it produced a sound unlike any other weapon. A buzzsaw scream that tore through flesh and equipment with equal indifference. American soldiers, weighed down with 60 pounds of gear, drowned before they could reach the sand. Those who made it ashore found no cover. The beach was a killing gallery. 600 yards of open ground under enfilade fire from bunkers, pillboxes, and mortar pits. Men huddled behind beach obstacles, Czech hedgehogs, Belgian gates, logs tipped with Teller mines, and waited to die. By 0700, the invasion was collapsing. The 116th Infantry Regiment had taken 60% casualties in some companies. Officers were dead. Radios were soaked and useless. Soldiers lay paralyzed by fear and exhaustion, pressed into the shingle, unable to move forward or back. Entire platoons ceased to exist as cohesive units. The Germans, watching from above, believed they had won. Some began to count bodies. Others reloaded and waited for the next wave, confident that American resolve would break long before German ammunition ran out. And then Norman Cota arrived. He came ashore with the second wave, stepping off a landing craft into waist-deep water as machine gun fire snapped overhead. He carried a .45 pistol on his hip and nothing else. No helmet, just his soft garrison cap. No carbine, no rifle. He walked through the surf like a man annoyed by the inconvenience, water streaming from his uniform, his face set in an expression of grim determination. Men who saw him later said he looked like a coach disappointed by a losing team. not a general walking through a firestorm. He reached the seawall and found what he expected: chaos. Wounded men screaming. Medics working with shaking hands. Officers crouched low, paralyzed by the enormity of the disaster. Kota moved among them, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Get off this beach. You're gonna die here if you stay. Move inland and you've got a chance." He grabbed sergeants by the shoulder, shoved lieutenants toward the bluffs, pointed at the smoke and fire above and barked, "There's the enemy. Go kill him." But words weren't enough. The men were beaten, hollowed out by 30 minutes of slaughter. They needed more than orders. They needed someone to show them it could be done. Kota found a Bangalore torpedo team, engineers tasked with blowing gaps through the German barbed wire that stretched in coils along the base of the bluffs. The team was pinned down, hugging the sand, unable to move. Kota walked over, yanked the torpedo from their hands, and assembled it himself under fire. He placed a charge, armed the fuse, and turned to the engineers. "Are you going to let me do this alone?" One of them, a kid from Pennsylvania, crawled forward. Then another. Then the rest. Kota lit the fuse and walked away, moving down the line to find another paralyzed unit. Behind him, the Bangalore detonated with a roar that shook the beach, tearing a gap 20 feet wide through the wire. Kota didn't wait. He walked through the gap, climbed 10 feet up the bluff, and turned back to the beach. Hundreds of eyes watched him. "Come on, you sons of bitches. Do you want to live forever?" His voice was hoarse, furious, and somehow calm all at once. Men started moving. First 1, then 5, then 50. They climbed. They crawled. They pulled each other up through the smoke and dust, following the crazy general, who walked upright, while bullets cracked past his head. At 0800, Kota reached the top of the bluff with a ragged company of rangers and infantrymen. They found a gap in the German defenses, a shallow draw, overlooked by the pre-invasion planners, barely wide enough for a jeep. Kota sent men through it, flanking the German strongpoints from behind. The first pillbox fell to grenades and rifle fire, then a second, then a third. The German gunners, trained to fire seaward, couldn't pivot fast enough to meet the Americans swarming from behind. By 0900, the Wehrmacht's hold on the eastern edge of Omaha Beach was broken. But breaking a strong point is not the same as winning a beachhead. The Germans still held the center of the beach, and reinforcements were moving up from inland reserves. Kota knew that if the Americans didn't push deeper, if they stopped to consolidate, the Germans would counterattack and shove them back into the sea. So he kept moving. He found a captain from the 29th Division, a man named Charles Cawthon, sitting exhausted against a stone wall. Kota grabbed him by the collar. "Captain, lead your men off this beach. If you stay here, you're dead." The turning point came at 1000 hours. Kota organized a combined assault on a German position that dominated the center of the beach, a concrete bunker housing a 75mm gun that had been ripping apart landing craft all morning. He coordinated infantry, engineers, and a Navy destroyer offshore that had risked grounding itself to provide close-fire support. The destroyer, USS McCook, fired 15 rounds of 5-inch shells directly into the bunker's embrasure at point-blank range, each shell screaming over the heads of American infantry just 50 yards below. The bunker exploded from within, fire and smoke pouring from every opening. Kota's men stormed it before the smoke cleared, killing the survivors and capturing the position. By noon, Omaha Beach was no longer a killing ground. It was a foothold, a narrow, fragile foothold, but enough. Engineers bulldozed paths through the shingle. Tanks and trucks began rolling ashore. Medical stations were set up. The dead were moved to the high water line, covered with ponchos, waiting for burial details. The living pushed inland, consolidating villages and crossroads, digging in against the inevitable German counterattack. Norman Kota moved through it all, tireless, refusing rest, refusing water. He reorganized shattered units, reassigned leaderless platoons, directed traffic, and kept the momentum going. Officers who met him that day described him as a force of nature, a man who seemed incapable of fear or fatigue. One colonel, watching Kota direct fire from an exposed ridge, said later, "He acted like he owned the place, like the Germans were trespassing and he was there to evict them. But Coda's heroism on Omaha Beach was not an accident. It was the product of a lifetime of training, doctrine, and a uniquely American understanding of warfare. The United States Army in 1944 was not the largest or the most experienced. German soldiers were often better trained in individual tactics. Soviet forces had endured years of brutal combat and knew how to suffer. But the Americans had something else: adaptability. The ability to take a disaster and turn it into victory within hours. The ability to replace casualties faster than the enemy could inflict them. And the industrial capacity to support that replacement indefinitely. Coda embodied that philosophy. He had spent his career studying maneuver warfare, reading Clausewitz and Patton, observing how small unit leaders could influence battles when higher command failed. He believed that initiative at the lowest levels, sergeants, corporals, even privates, was the key to victory in modern war, and he trained his men accordingly. During the build-up to D-Day, Coda drilled the 29th Division relentlessly. He ran them through live-fire exercises in England, simulating beach landings under artillery fire. He taught them to move under fire, to think under fire, to lead under fire. He told them again and again, "When you hit that beach, the plan is going to fall apart. Your officers will be dead. Your radios won't work, and you're going to have to figure it out yourselves." His philosophy was vindicated on June 6th. When the plan collapsed, when the bombardment failed, when officers died in the first minutes, it was the sergeants and corporals, the men Coda had trained, who kept moving. It was the privates who crawled forward when every instinct screamed to stay down. And it was Coda, walking upright through a hurricane of steel, who showed them it could be done. The German gunner who had laughed at 0630 was dead by 1100. His MG-42 was silent, its barrel warped from sustained fire, its crew buried under the rubble of their position. The Wehrmacht officers who had counted American bodies now counted their own losses and realized the truth. They had underestimated the enemy. Not because the Americans were better soldiers, individually they weren't, but because the Americans refused to accept defeat. They adapted, improvised, and overwhelmed through sheer relentless pressure and industrial might. By evening, Omaha Beach was secure. 5,000 Americans were dead or wounded, but 34,000 were ashore, and the foothold was expanding. German commanders, reading the reports, understood what it meant. The Atlantic Wall, the impregnable fortress that was supposed to stop the Allies at the water's edge, had been breached, and once breached, it could never be repaired. The American machine, slow to start but impossible to stop, was now on European soil. Norman Coda would go on to fight through France, Belgium, and Germany. He would earn the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the undying respect of every man who served under him. But his greatest achievement was those 4 hours on Omaha Beach, when he took a massacre and turned it into a miracle. The aftermath of Omaha Beach rippled across the European theater like a shockwave through granite. Within 72 hours, over 170,000 Allied troops had poured ashore across all 5 landing zones. Within a week, the beachhead was 20 miles deep. Within a month, Cherbourg had fallen, giving the Allies a deep water port capable of handling the industrial tonnage required to sustain mechanized warfare on a continental scale. The Wehrmacht, bloodied and reeling, pulled back to defensive lines and waited for the inevitable, the American avalanche. Norman Coda's actions on June 6th had done more than save a single beach. They had validated a doctrine, a way of thinking about war that was uniquely American and terrifyingly effective. It wasn't about individual heroism, though heroism abounded. It wasn't about superior tactics, though American tactics improved daily. It was about system. It was about the ability to absorb catastrophic losses and continue operating at full capacity. It was about replacing destroyed equipment in 48 hours when the enemy needed 6 months. It was about training replacement officers in 3 weeks when the Germans couldn't replace theirs at all. And it was about leveraging industrial output so vast, so overwhelming, that the enemy's best efforts became statistically irrelevant. By July 1944, German intelligence officers were compiling reports that read like horror stories. One Abwehr analyst, captured later near Falaise, carried a notebook filled with desperate calculations. He had counted American vehicles moving through a single crossroads in Normandy over a 6-hour period. 1,200 trucks, 300 half-tracks, 80 tanks, 50 self-propelled guns, 40 armored cars, and 15 bulldozers. He wrote in the margin, in cramped handwriting, "This is one road. They have 100 roads. How do we stop this?" The answer, though he didn't write it, was simple. They couldn't. The American logistical machine was a marvel of industrial warfare. Every day, the supply chain delivered to the Normandy front 20,000 tons of ammunition, 15,000 tons of rations, 800,000 gallons of gasoline, 500 replacement vehicles, 3,000 replacement soldiers, and enough medical supplies to establish field hospitals faster than the Germans could evacuate their wounded. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system of 6,000 trucks driven by predominantly black soldiers, ran 24 hours a day, moving supplies from the beaches to the front lines at a pace that defied belief. German commanders, accustomed to supply shortages and fuel rationing, couldn't comprehend an army that had so much of everything that waste was acceptable. Cotta himself moved inland with the 29th Division, pushing through the hedgerows of Normandy. The bocage country, ancient farmland crisscrossed by dense hedgerows and sunken roads, became a killing ground worse in some ways than Omaha Beach. Every field was a potential ambush. Every hedgerow concealed German machine gun nests and anti-tank guns. Progress was measured in yards per day, and the casualties mounted with suffocating monotony. But Cotta's doctrine held. When a company got pinned down, sergeants didn't wait for orders, they flanked. When a tank was knocked out, engineers welded salvaged steel onto the next one, creating improvised tusks that could rip through hedgerows and deny the Germans their defensive advantage. The Americans didn't fight smarter in the bocage. They fought relentlessly, accepting losses that would have broken other armies, and kept pushing. On July 11th, Cotta led a night assault on the town of St. Lo, a critical road junction that controlled access to the interior of France. The attack was brutal, house-to-house fighting in darkness, grenades through windows, flamethrowers clearing cellars. Cotta was everywhere, directing fire teams, coordinating artillery, dragging wounded men into cover. At one point, a German sniper nearly killed him. The bullet passed through his jacket, missing his ribs by an inch. Cotta didn't pause. He found the sniper's position, called in a 105mm howitzer strike, and watched the building collapse into rubble. St. Lo fell after 4 days of fighting. The Germans lost 3,000 men defending it. The Americans lost 2,000 taking it. But the Americans replaced their losses within a week. The Germans never did. By late July, the strategic situation in Normandy had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the bocage, unleashed General George Patton's Third Army into the French countryside. Patton's armor raced south and east, cutting German supply lines, encircling entire divisions, and advancing so fast that German headquarters couldn't track his positions. The Wehrmacht, designed for methodical maneuver and deliberate defense, couldn't cope with the speed and chaos. American tank columns moved day and night, refueling from jerrycans dropped by air, bypassing strongpoints and leaving them to be mopped up by infantry following behind. Patton's after-action reports read like fiction. 50 miles in one day, 70 miles the next, entire German regiments surrendering without a fight because they had no fuel, no ammunition, and no orders. The German response was predictable: counterattack. On August 7th, Hitler personally ordered Operation Luttich, a desperate armored thrust aimed at cutting off Patton's advance by driving to the coast at Avranches. It was the last major German offensive in the West, and it was doomed before it began. The attack involved 4 panzer divisions, including the elite 2nd and 116th Panzer, supported by infantry and assault guns. On paper, it was formidable. In reality, it was suicide. The Americans saw them coming. Ultra-intercepts, decrypted German radio traffic, gave Allied commanders complete knowledge of the attack plan days in advance. Fighter bombers from the 9 Tactical Air Command circled overhead, waiting. When the panzers rolled forward at dawn, they drove into a killing zone that had been prepared with industrial precision. P-47 Thunderbolts dropped from the sky in waves, each aircraft carrying 2 1,000-pound bombs. 8 5-inch rockets, and 2,500 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The Thunderbolt was not a nimble dogfight. It was a flying sledgehammer, designed to absorb punishment and deliver overwhelming firepower at low altitude. Its 8 M2 Browning machine guns produced a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,400 rounds per minute, creating a cone of destruction 200 yards wide. Pilots called it the Jug because of its bulky shape, but German tankers had another name for it, der Kettensäge, the chainsaw. The attack on the panzer columns was methodical and merciless. Thunderbolts dove in pairs, one aircraft suppressing anti-aircraft fire while the other lined up on a tank. Rockets streaked down, punching through engine decks and turret roofs. Bombs cratered roads and flipped tanks onto their sides. Machine gun fire shredded trucks, half-tracks, and infantry caught in the open. A German panzer commander, interviewed after the war, described it as hell in daylight. He said, "We could not move. We could not hide. Every time we tried to advance, the J-bows came. They did not stop. There was no pause, no rest. We burned our tanks ourselves and ran into the woods because to stay on the road was death." By the end of August 7th, the German counterattack had been annihilated. Over 100 tanks destroyed, 2,000 men dead. The survivors retreated in disorder, abandoning vehicles for lack of fuel. The Falaise Pocket, a massive encirclement of German forces caught between American, British, and Canadian armies, closed like a trap. Inside the pocket, 50,000 German soldiers surrendered. Another 10,000 were killed trying to escape. The roads were choked with wrecked vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned equipment. Allied soldiers walking through the carnage wore gas masks to filter the stench of rotting flesh. It was the end of the Wehrmacht as an effective fighting force in France. Norman Cota was there, moving through the pocket with his division, accepting surrenders, organizing prisoner processing, ensuring that medical care reached German wounded as well as American. He was promoted to Major General in September, taking command of the 28th Infantry Division. His reputation had solidified. The general who walked through fire and made other men brave. Soldiers who served under him said he had no fear, but that wasn't quite true. Cota felt fear like any man. He simply refused to let it dictate his actions. The advance continued through the fall. Paris liberated in late August. Brussels in early September. By October, American forces were pressing against the German border, preparing to breach the Siegfried Line and invade the Reich itself. The war, it seemed, would be over by Christmas. But the Germans weren't finished. In mid-December, Hitler launched his final gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was a massive surprise attack through the Belgian forests, aimed at splitting the Allied armies and recapturing the port of Antwerp. The initial assault was devastatingly effective. German forces, hidden by fog and low clouds that grounded Allied aircraft, smashed through thinly held American lines. Entire regiments were surrounded and forced to surrender. Panic spread through rear area units. For 48 hours, it seemed possible that the Germans might actually succeed. Cota's 28th Division was directly in the path of the offensive. Positioned along the Our River in Luxembourg, they faced the full weight of the 5th Panzer Army, 3 panzer divisions and supporting infantry, over 40,000 men. Cota's division numbered 14,000, under strength from months of continuous combat. The odds were impossible. The terrain favored the attacker, and yet Cota held. For 3 days, the 28th Division fought a delaying action that military historians still study as a masterpiece of defensive warfare. Cota ordered his units to fall back slowly, contesting every village, every bridge, every crossroad. They mined roads. They blew bridges. They set ambushes in the forests and melted away before the Germans could retaliate. They called in artillery on their own positions as they withdrew, hammering German infantry, struggling to keep up with the tanks. The division lost 6,000 men in those 3 days, killed, wounded, or captured, but they bought time. Time for Patton's Third Army to pivot north. Time for reinforcements to arrive. Time for the weather to clear and Allied air power to return. On December 23rd, the skies over the Ardennes cleared. The result was apocalyptic for the Germans. Over 5,000 Allied sorties were flown that day alone, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, transport planes dropping supplies to surrounded units. The German advance, which had relied on speed and surprise, ground to a halt under relentless air attack. Fuel depots were destroyed. Supply columns were incinerated. Panzer divisions, which had raced 50 miles in 2 days, found themselves immobilized for lack of gasoline. By January 1945, the bulge had been eliminated, and the Wehrmacht had lost 100,000 men, 600 tanks, and 1,600 aircraft it could never replace. Coda emerged from the bulge with his third star under discussion and a legend that had spread beyond the American army. German intelligence files captured later included his name with a notation: aggressive, fearless, prioritize elimination. It was, in a perverse way, a compliment. The final months of the war were a race. The Allies drove east. The Soviets drove west. Germany, caught between industrial superpowers, collapsed city by city. American forces crossed the Rhine in March, pushed through the Ruhr in April, and linked up with Soviet forces at the Elbe River on April 25, 1945. The Third Reich, which had promised to last 1,000 years, died in its 13th. Norman Coda stood on German soil in May 1945, watching columns of Wehrmacht prisoners march past. They were hollow-eyed, exhausted, beaten not just by force of arms, but by the realization that they had fought an unwinnable war. And old Feldwebel, a sergeant with the Iron Cross on his chest and scars on his face, stopped in front of Coda and stared at him. Coda met his eyes. The German said in broken English, "You did not fight like soldiers. You fought like a machine. We could not stop you." Coda nodded slowly. "We fought like Americans," he said. The German shook his head and walked on. The numbers tell the story better than any narrative. Between June 1944 and May 1945, the United States produced 17,000 combat aircraft, 12,000 tanks, 50,000 trucks, 2 million rifles, 40 billion rounds of ammunition, and trained 500,000 replacement soldiers. In the same period, Germany produced 4,000 aircraft, 3,000 tanks, and trained 80,000 replacements. The disparity wasn't just quantitative, it was existential. The Americans built an industrial system that treated war as a production problem and solved it with the same efficiency they applied to automobiles and refrigerators. The Germans built a war machine dependent on slave labor, scarce resources, and increasingly desperate improvisations. One side could replace losses indefinitely. The other couldn't. The human cost was staggering. American casualties in the European theater: 135,000 dead, 500,000 wounded. German casualties: 3 million dead, 7 million captured or missing. The Third Reich bled out not in heroic last stands but in slow, grinding attrition, losing more men than it could train, more tanks than it could build, more fuel than it could refine. By 1945, German tank crews were rolling into battle with 10 hours of training. American crews had 500 hours. German fighters had fuel for 1 sortie per day. American fighters flew 4. The war became mathematical, and mathematics favored the side with more of everything. Norman Coda retired from the Army in 1946 with the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and the undying gratitude of thousands of men who believed they owed him their lives. He refused most interview requests, avoided publicity, and lived quietly in Philadelphia until his death in 1971. When asked about Omaha Beach, he would only say, "I did what anyone would have done." It was a lie, but a noble one. Most men, faced with that beach, would have stayed down. Coda stood up. Today, you can walk Omaha Beach. The tide still rolls, and twice a day, washing clean the sand where 2,000 Americans died before noon. The bluffs are quiet now, covered in grass, dotted with memorials. The German bunkers remain, crumbling concrete tombs open to the sky. Tourists take photos. Children run along the waterline. The horror is gone, replaced by peace. But in the museum above the beach, in a glass case near the entrance, there is a letter. It was written by a German officer, found in his effects after he was killed near Cannes in July 1944. The letter was never sent. It reads, in part, "We were told the Americans were soft, that they loved comfort and hated sacrifice, that they would break when the fighting became hard. We were told lies. The Americans are not soft. They are not cowards. They are something worse. They are inevitable. You cannot kill them faster than they replace themselves. You cannot destroy their equipment faster than they build more. They are a flood, and we are drowning. The sky over Normandy belongs to ghosts now, but the ghosts remember. They remember the general who walked through hell and made other men follow. They remember the machine that would not stop. They remember the day the Atlantic Wall fell, and with it, the last hope of the Third Reich. If you love untold stories from history's darkest hours, subscribe and join us on the next mission through time.